So, really quick thing I want to address here. Some people have been like, why are these so short? They're not really designed to be long. These are designed to be little lore tidbits. And in some cases, obviously, I'll have more to talk about. Depends on the subject. But the idea is this isn't supposed to be some massive lore dump. This is little bits of lore that you can digest easier to make this more accessible to people who don't have time to sit down for 5 hours and learn all this stuff. So I'm not trying to elongate or to truncate. I'm talking until I'm done. But that's why I'm only covering one topic at a time rather than branching out. Make sense? So with that being said, let's talk about the next requested thing. Fairies. Now, fairies in my setting, I had to explain this around a little bit because obviously most people have other perceptions of fairies. Fairies are fully grown. Average height is about 6 feet. Fully grown individual, they do have wings. These wings vary wildly in pattern and style, but for the most part they do tend to follow the butterfly style rather than, say, bird or bat style. So, many different patterns, many different shapes that the wings can actually take. The wings themselves are mostly decorative. A fairy can, with experience and work and effort, use those to hover a little bit and to keep themselves aloft just a little bit, but actually flying is not feasible for a fairy. There are male and female fairies, but they cannot reproduce. They lack any kind of organs or anything like that. They do have relationships and romantic entanglements on a mental and emotional level, but they can never and will never have children. They literally lack the biology for it. Fairies have something innate to them. I call it fairy sight. I had to explain early on that it's not something you have to activate to a couple of players who were playing fairies. It's not something you activate. It is literally always on. It's a part of your vision. They see differently than we do. So they can see the elements in a very literal, visual way. They can see, look over there, there's fire, and there's water, and there's spatial, and there's life, So they functionally, visibly, are constantly perceiving the elements, literally and directly. This is also kind of tied into how the fairies work. The fairies themselves are probably one of the most elemental of creatures. Their entire society, I don't want to call it their religion, but more like their viewpoint on life tends to be very focused on the elements and the elementalism thereof. Most of the geomancers in the world tend to be fairies, that kind of a thing. Fairies, let's talk about how fairies come into being. There is a pool of perfectly clear white water that exists in the city of Arwick. And this pool, every now and again, and it's not common. It happens once every few months, sometimes once every couple of years. A brand new fairy just walks out of the pool. They literally, just now. In the early days, most of the time these fairies were just like, huh? You're not really sure what to do about anything. But there's been a long-established system. There's actually a structure around this pool to help maintain and keep it. There's rooms, there's libraries, there's stuff, and there's an entire staff who are paid just to sit there and wait for a fairy to come out. And again, I mentioned it can be years before a new fairy comes out, so sometimes just nothing happens for huge periods of time. But as you're waiting there, the fairy comes out, and when they come out, they're a little bit odd. They have no experience, no memories, but they can speak language fully, and they have full motor control of their ability, their function. You could call it similar to the amnesiac situation of how amnesia actually works in real life. Lacking some of the structure, but still knowing how to do things like, to read and to understand the meanings of words and to be able to move around like that. It's similar, not quite the same. So a fairy comes out fully formed, fully adult. Fairies do age, although extremely slowly. A fairy's lifespan is quite long, usually in the centuries range, although most fairies have never actually reached that age because most fairies end up dying. You might be like, well, why? Well, there's no given reason. It's not like someone out there is hunting fairies. It's just most fairies, as a virtue of living in a dangerous world for long periods of time, eventually just run into something that kills them. So the actual answer is the upper limit of fairy lifespan has not actually been established. The oldest known fairy was one who died 30 years ago during the Tumrock incident back in Dryreach. That fairy was 120-ish. I forget the exact age, but it was just a little over a century old when the Tumrocks invaded, and, well, they're dead now, obviously. I mean, there's no way they could have survived that invasion, for God's sakes. Nothing could, right? So that's the age span. I mentioned their hair color can be virtually anything. They could also not have hair. They don't actually grow hair in the same way we do, so their hair is basically just like their finger, kind of an equivalent. It's a part of their being. So it doesn't grow, and if you cut it off, it will not grow back. This has led to a big cultural thing about what you do with your hair. If your hair gets cut against your will, it's considered a really, really bad thing. I mean, if you want to tell someone you hate them, you loathe this person, if and they're a fairy, cutting off a bit of their hair is the kind of thing you can do to just completely destroy and demoralize them. Because again, they're not getting their hair back. Now, there is actually a way to grow that hair back, and indeed to grow back other parts. This applies to the wings as well. The wings, the hair, both of these things can be restored, but it requires very specific circumstances. And honestly, I shouldn't even say anymore because none of the party members are aware of this fact. But suffice it to say, certain arc weavers have the ability to weave energy back into the elf, or excuse me, the fairy, in a way that produces that. Elf. Yeah, elves are totally not this. The fairy, I mentioned they could fly. I mentioned the elemental sight. Fairies can innately and naturally see anyone who is a desolate, thanks to the elemental sight. Whatever they see is just wrong. I mean, they look at something and it literally looks wrong. It's just ha ha. And a fairy automatically fails a will save against a desolate, unless under very specific circumstances. And even then, they roll at a disadvantage. And the minimum a fairy will always be is at disadvantage against desolation, because it's just so contrary to their nature. Earlier on in the adventure, before we went to the live campaign, Hanuel had found another fairy, whose name I can't remember, who had been amongst the refugees of the Stoneholders, who was rabid and insane with rage and violent fury, was actually trying to literally chew off the Hanuel's arm in his just mind-destroying psychosis. And that is that is how fairies react to desolation. They don't just hate you for some reason they don't understand. They don't invent some reason, oh, you're a race, or you're a species, or you're a gender, or whatever. No. They just go rabid. They completely lose all self-control and want to kill and destroy everything around them in the most brutal way possible. This has happened several times. In fact, if you'll remember, last week, I think, the very first recorded history ever of a desolate being discovered, although again this is recorded history, was found out by a fairy. You can probably see how badly that went. That fairy actually had to be killed as a result of that. And yes, that's another reason why fairies do tend to not live long lives, because if a fairy encounters a desolate, it's nothing for it. The most common theory about this is the obvious one, that desolates are just wrong, that they don't fit with the elements in some way, because fairies are all about the elements, and that their very existence is elemental. And so something about desolates is anti-elemental, and it just snaps a fairy's brain, and they can't deal with it. Now, there is a higher percentage of fairies that are green mages than any other race. Fairies being so naturally elementally attuned, it kind of makes sense. Remember, a green mage has to be born a green mage. You cannot learn it. You cannot be taught it. I have actually bent the rules several times to allow players to be a green mage, not initial, in other words, to learn green magery. But in each time when I say bend, I mean it's more like they awoke to become a green mage later. In other words, in lore terms, they were always a green mage, they just didn't know it. And so they have awoken as one. But it's obvious why fairies tend to be so predominant as summoners, and they tend to have very, very close connections to their aspects. Now, fairies are also one of the only races that have gone out of their way to actively seek out elementals. There are two types of elementals, basically, wild and free. These are rough terms. A wild elemental is kind of like a feral golem, which we talked about last week, something that is an innate danger to everything around it. Then there are free elementals, which actively go out of their way to make pacts and social contracts, and like to interact and hang out with people. There's a reason for this that no one's aware of yet, so I can't share that. But suffice it to say that fairies tend to go out and search out elementals of either type as a regular thing because they have an easier time finding them, even from a great distance, and want to find more of those free elementals and bring them in and take care of them and interact with them because they I wouldn't say they worship the elements, but they certainly revere the elements in generally as a culture, as a society. I don't have the stats of fairies on top of me. Someone actually asked a stat-specific question, so I'm going to do a whole separate episode on that. So that gets to wait. I will talk a little bit about the fairies on a organizational level, because the fairies actually have their own city-state, which is called Arwick. I mentioned that earlier. Arwick is a part of the Eluvian monarchy, the Eluvian kingdom, but it's effectively separate. It's basically a vassal state for all intents and purposes, and that is the fairy state. Now, of course, there are fairies that don't belong to Arwick, quite a few of them actually, but Arwick also takes care of an organization called the Zephyrs. Now, the Zephyrs are a go-out-and-do-it team of elite fairies that have been active ever since the Daracos Accords were ratified. The Zephyrs basically... Here's Nation A, or not even Nation, here's Organization A, here's Organization B. They want to interact with each other, but they're having trouble. There's cultural boundaries, there's societal boundaries. They don't speak each other's language, or they don't want to speak each other's language, or they hate each other. The Zephyrs step in, and they're the intermediaries. They're the people who say, okay. So they do this constantly, and they've been doing this for about a century, ever since the Daracos Accords were ratified. So they'll talk, trade agreements, diplomatic agreements, arranged marriages. This is even in more mundane things, non-medieval things, like, for example, mergers amongst companies, or the foundation of a new guild, or whatever. The Zephyrs are the mediators. That's their job. They tend to be well paid for that job, but oftentimes the Zephyrs do not actually ask for payment. They simply receive it as gratitude for services rendered. Now, what the Zephyrs have been up to lately is a little different. Technically, I shouldn't tell you this because no one's actually aware of this in character, but I'll go ahead and drop this. The Zephyrs tried to back out of the Eluvian kingdom because they really, really, really disagree with the idea of a war for some reason. I don't know why. And they were kind of disallowed from doing that, and long story short, they're about to switch loyalties. That actually hasn't happened yet as of now, so I don't want to talk too much more about that. But the Zephyrs will definitely be making a little bit of an impact soon, and we'll see how that ties up soon. Let's see, am I missing anything? I talked about that, I talked about how they were birthed. Javan, in particular, is kind of unique, because he is effectively part elemental, part fairy at this point. That makes him in a very dangerous position. It is exceptionally likely that he will not be able to just keep going on as if business as usual, because the fairies in general are not going to like him, and anyone dealing with the elements is not going to like him, including the Order. I mentioned the gender thing, I mentioned the lack of... I think that's actually everything. One other thing. Fairies obviously do not have clan names for the obvious reason. Sometimes a fairy will take on the clan name of someone else, like if they mate with someone, if they decide to marry someone or be with someone, they will take on that person's clan name as a sign that they are now connected, that they are now part of the same family. But fairies have no clan names of their own. They're just, they don't even have surnames. They just have their name. And as an aside, a fairy knows their own name the moment they come out of the pool. It's one of the only things they know about themselves. And as a final note, fairies' personalities are not what you'd think, because normally a sentient creature, this applies to even real humans in real life, a sentient creature which is born, their personality is morphed and affected by the things they go through, their experiences, their times, all that fun stuff. And so over time, they grow more of a personality. This is the droid thing I've talked about in Star Wars so many times, and is effective in other places as well. Fairies don't do that. A fairy comes out and they have their personality, and it will never change. They may change a little bit in the way they act and react, but their core personality is in them the moment they walk out of that pool, just like their name. Before you ask, no one actually knows why the fairies come out of the pool, what the pool is, or really anything. Although people have, of course, studied the pool extensively, and the best they've been able to come up with is it's this massive nexus of energy, of mana. And they're not sure why, or how, or what. But they do know that the elements kind of swim through it, which makes a degree of sense. that's all I got about fairies. Hope you enjoyed. Next week we'll be talking about another topic. So, see you then.